going over to my guest, Andrew Bostom, who is an academic. He's an MD. He's the author of The Legacy of Jihad, The Legacy of Islamic Antisemitism, Sharia versus Freedom. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Sam. I wanted to thank you, by the way, for intervening so I could speak at that great conference in St. Louis. And I just want to let your audience know that actually the highlight for me was meeting you in person. I could tell from our conversations how bright you were, but your audience should know just how warm and self-effacing and lovely you are. And I hope that doesn't embarrass you, but I felt compelled to say that.
You forgot that I have big feet.
Oh, you do have big feet.
You should have thrown that in. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Okay, let's fight.
Okay, yeah, exactly. That's fine, right. That's how we're gonna...
So you support Trump's position that Bush really fouled everything up by going into Iraq, correct? Why don't you take it from here and let us know where you stand on all this?
Well, he's such a blunt instrument, and I didn't like the way he presented his case, of course, because I almost never do. Even though there was, in the end, there's usually substance to what he's saying, however crudely he puts it. But I would, without trying to, walk back too much, and being too nuanced, it just caused me to re-examine some data points that never have made any sense to me, and to re-examine why, in fact, for example, we chose to go into Iraq and make these claims about WMD. And I know we've had a back and forth about this, but in the end, the real claim was that an active weaponization program. We knew the horrific things that the Saddam regime had done to the Kurds, and even, by the way, to Iran during the 1980s. The real claim that the Bush administration was making is that there was this active program, both chemical, biological, and perhaps even nuclear weapons. And the truth is, Sam, that the CIA's own report, the Dwelfer report, debunked those claims. They didn't do it with great joy, but they debunked those claims. They did point out things that you've mentioned, that in fact there were still, however, some of these repositories of deteriorating, particularly chemical weapons from the 1980s, and those could be put to nefarious purposes, but they weren't really the kinds of things that were being touted. And the other thing that disturbed me in going over all this, again, because of Trump's, crude statements, was that in August of 2002, so a good 6 months before we went into Iraq, two major new facilities designed for nuclear weapons program were discovered by a dissident group in Iran. The Natanz uranium enrichment facility, and the plutonium reactor in Iraq, not Iraq, Iraq. These were revealed again in August of 2002, and nothing was done about them, despite, in the post-9/11 era, this I think, understandable hysteria about WMD in the possession of jihadist states. And no one would deny that Iran was at least, certainly at that time, a more powerful jihadist state than Iraq, and yet we did nothing about that. And I also went back to this, really, I urge your readers to get a hold of this story. Sometimes it's behind a firewall. I can actually send it to you as a PDF. It was a great investigative report published in 2004 in the Wall Street Journal, and it relates how within 8 days of 9/11 occurring, Bernard Lewis, who was the neocons' go-to person on all things Islam, was lobbying heavily for this idea that the real solution to the jihadism emanating from the Middle East was basically to conquer these despotic regimes, starting with Iraq, and seed democracy. And he was putting this forth heavily with, unfortunately, a guy who I think, he's passed away, but evidence suggests he might have been an Iranian operative, Ahmed Chalabi. And they were lobbying the coterie around President Bush, and ultimately Cheney and Bush himself, that this was the way to solve the horrific problems which manifested on 9/11. And you can see Bush's rhetoric matching Lewis's arguments very consistently, Cheney's rhetoric matching Lewis's arguments very consistently, and the whole idea of WMD sort of falling by the wayside. So, again, I don't agree with how Trump made this case. It really did sound like a Code Pink type of assessment of things. But I think there are serious questions here. They really are.
It's Code Trump, I think, is what it's called now. Well, part of the problem is the way that he presented it was that 9/11 was Bush's fault, which is absurd because they've shown that it took years of planning. So how can you lay years of planning at Bush's feet? That's just a joke. That's ridiculous. However, if you want to talk about the democratization of Iraq, at the time that they were going into Iraq and saying weapons of mass destruction, and I was an idiot back then, I'll admit. I wasn't really that involved, but to me it sounded very trite and absurd to lay everything at the feet of this idea of weapons of mass destruction. It was very clear that he had weapons of mass destruction, because he used them. So they were there. Whether we could find them or not, I thought maybe doubtful. And in fact, we eventually found them in Syria. But, be that as it may, I thought at the time that it was silly for them to say, well, we're going in because of weapons of mass destruction. They were going in to seed democracy. It was very clear the moment, basically 10 minutes after they went over there, that they were trying to seed democracy, SEED. And in the end, they ended up seeding democracy, CEDE, because there's no way to seed, SEED, a democracy in a society that doesn't understand freedom.
Well, but I guess the shocking thing to me, though, is that if you sort of fast forward to all the dangerous and destabilizing events that occurred in the so-called Arab Spring, and since you're an actress, you may know the movie reference. The Mel Brooks movie that with the producers.
Nope, I don't know it.
the producers.
I know, Springtime for Hitler. We're running out of time.
Springtime for
I'm sorry.
Sharia,
you can't have democracy and Sharia coexist, which is what we tried to do, but we succeeded. Remember, it was stable while we were there, but we didn't want to stay. Okay, I've got to take a break. Andrew Bostom, thanks so much for coming on. Stay tuned. I'll be right back.